Steelers Nation! Everything inside the Pittsburgh Steelers building suddenly feels completely different, and honestly, you can already sense that this organization is entering a brand new era before a single regular season snap has even been played. The biggest reason for that shift is the arrival of Mike McCarthy as the new head coach, because according to reports coming directly out of practices and inside the facility, the atmosphere, structure, and overall philosophy around this team have changed in a major way. What's fascinating is that people outside Pittsburgh continued trying to compare Mike McCarthy to Mike Tomlin simply because both are veteran coaches with Super Bowl resumes and traditional football backgrounds. But the early observations from inside the building are painting a completely different picture. Reports from Steelers practices describe McCarthy as far more hands-on with the actual football operation itself, deeply involved in the X's and O's, heavily focused on details during practice, and running a much more regimented daily structure. That's a massive development for this franchise because for years, many Steelers fans felt like the organization needed schematic evolution more than motivational speeches. The leadership inside the locker room was never really the problem. This team already has respected veterans capable of controlling the emotional side of the roster. Aaron Rodgers brings enormous experience to the offensive side of the ball. Cam Hayward remains one of the strongest leaders in the entire organization. TJ Watt sets the tone defensively every single week. DK Metcalf adds another major personality and competitor into the room. The Steelers were never lacking voices. What they were lacking was innovation and adaptability, and that's why this transition feels so important right now. The reports coming out of OTAs suggest that McCarthy is attacking this job with a completely different approach than what Steelers fans became accustomed to over the years. Instead of operating mostly as a culture manager, the new head coach appears heavily invested in the finer details of practice execution, offensive concepts, and teaching fundamentals on the field. That matters because the Steelers' offense had become predictable far too often in recent seasons, and now the organization is handing the keys to a coach known for consistently producing high-level offensive systems throughout his career. At the same time, the defensive side may be undergoing an even more dramatic transformation thanks to Patrick Graham and the coaching staff being assembled around him. One of the clearest examples of that shift came directly from Steelers secondary coach Joe Witt Jr., who made an eye-opening comparison involving Jalen Ramsey. And this wasn't just casual praise. Witt compared Ramsey's skill set to Charles Woodson, the legendary defensive back he previously coached in Green Bay during Woodson's Defensive Player of the Year season. That comparison immediately grabbed attention because of how specifically Joe Witt Jr. described the role. According to him, Charles Woodson succeeded because he could line up literally everywhere: cornerback, safety, slot defender, hybrid linebacker responsibilities. He became a movable chess piece capable of changing the entire structure of a defense depending on the situation. And now the Steelers coaching staff clearly believes Jalen Ramsey can handle a very similar role in Pittsburgh. That tells you everything about where this defense is heading. The Steelers are no longer thinking in terms of rigid positional labels. They want versatility. They want disguised looks. They want interchangeable defenders who can shift responsibilities from snap to snap and confuse quarterbacks before the play even develops. And Ramsey appears to be at the center of those plans. The expectation right now is that Ramsey will spend significant time playing what the Steelers are calling the star role, essentially functioning as a big nickel defender. That role allows him to operate close to the line of scrimmage, contribute heavily against the run, attack underneath routes, and still utilize his elite instincts in coverage. Then, in obvious passing situations, the defense may transition him into an even more dangerous assignment as a roaming money backer, where he can patrol the middle of the field almost like a hybrid linebacker. Honestly, when you look at Ramsey's current stage of his career, this may be the perfect evolution for him. He's still an extremely intelligent player. He's still physical. He's still one of the best tackling defensive backs in football. And even though he may not possess the same pure outside corner explosiveness from earlier in his career, the Steelers coaching staff appears ready to maximize every strength he still brings to the field. What makes this even more intriguing is the connection between Patrick Graham and Joe Witt Jr. Both coaches understand how to use versatile defenders because they were part of the Green Bay staff that successfully transformed Charles Woodson into one of the most impactful defensive weapons in football. That experience matters. This is not an experimental idea for them. They've seen this type of role dominate games before, but maybe the most underrated development from these OTA reports involves Peyton Wilson. Because while most of the conversation around the Steelers' defense naturally focuses on stars like TJ Watt and Jalen Ramsey, Joe Witt Jr. Jr. quietly included Peyton Wilson in that same category of weaponized defenders, and that says a lot about what this coaching staff sees in him moving forward. A lot of fans have almost forgotten how talented Peyton Wilson actually is. Coming out of NC State, many evaluators believed he had some of the best linebacker film in his entire draft class. The reason he slipped was not talent, it was durability concerns surrounding his knees. But from a pure football standpoint, Wilson entered the league with elite athleticism, range, speed, and perhaps most importantly, outstanding blitzing ability. And that's where things could become very dangerous under this new defensive structure. During his college career, Wilson produced over 10 sacks across the 2022 and 2023 seasons, showing a rare ability to attack quarterbacks from linebacker alignments. Yet under the previous Steelers defensive system, his skill set never seemed fully unleashed. Now, with Patrick Graham and Joe Witt Jr. designing more flexible pressure packages, there's growing belief that Wilson could finally become a true weapon on passing downs. Imagine the pressure this defense could create if offenses are forced to account for TJ Watt screaming off the edge while Peyton Wilson threatens blitzes from the interior before suddenly dropping into coverage at the snap. That kind of unpredictability is exactly what modern NFL defenses are trying to build. And honestly, it feels like the Steelers are finally embracing that evolution. The biggest takeaway from all these OTA developments is that Pittsburgh no longer appears satisfied with simply maintaining the old identity. This coaching staff is actively reshaping how the Steelers operate schematically on both sides of the football, and early signs suggest players are being placed into far more aggressive and specialized roles than before. The question now becomes whether these massive changes will immediately translate once the regular season begins. Because if this new coaching structure truly unlocks players like Jalen Ramsey and Peyton Wilson while allowing Mike McCarthy to modernize the offense around Aaron Rodgers, the Steelers may become one of the most fascinating teams in the entire NFL this season. But here's the real question Steelers fans need to ask themselves right now. Could this actually be the beginning of the biggest transformation the franchise has experienced in years? What really stands out about everything happening inside the Steelers organization right now is that this doesn't feel like a simple coaching transition anymore. This feels like a full philosophical reset, especially defensively, and the more information that continues coming out of OTAs, the clearer it becomes that Pittsburgh is preparing to play a completely different brand of football than what fans watched over the last several years. And honestly, one of the biggest signs of that change is the way the new coaching staff keeps talking about versatility instead of positions. That matters because under the previous defensive structure, players often looked restricted to very specific responsibilities. The system itself sometimes felt predictable. Opposing offenses usually knew where pressure was coming from, knew where defenders would align, and understood the general structure before the snap even happened. But now, Patrick Graham and Joe Witt Jr. are building something that sounds far more flexible and aggressive. The Jalen Ramsey situation is probably the best example of that entire philosophy, because when coaches start comparing a player to Charles Woodson, they are not simply talking about talent, they are talking about usage. They are talking about creating confusion for offenses every single snap. Charles Woodson became so dominant late in his career because offenses couldn't identify what he was doing before the ball was snapped. Sometimes he looked like a safety, sometimes a corner, sometimes a blitzer, sometimes a linebacker sitting in the middle of the field waiting to jump a route. That is exactly the kind of chaos the Steelers appear interested in creating with Ramsey. And when you think about the personnel Pittsburgh now has defensively, the possibilities become extremely interesting. TJ Watt already demands constant attention from offensive lines. Cam Hayward still commands respect inside. Patrick Queen brings athleticism at linebacker. Peyton Wilson adds range and blitzing ability. Minkah Fitzpatrick remains one of the smartest safeties in football. Now you add a player like Jalen Ramsey moving around the formation with freedom, and suddenly quarterbacks may have a very difficult time identifying where pressure or coverage rotations are actually coming from. That's how elite modern defenses operate. They don't just rely on talent anymore. They rely on disguise. And it sounds like Patrick Graham fully understands that. What should excite Steelers fans even more is the fact that this coaching staff doesn't appear interested in using players traditionally. They want to maximize specific traits. That's why the discussions around Peyton Wilson are so important right now, because for a while, many fans started treating Wilson like a rotational piece instead of a potential impact defender. But internally, the Steelers coaching staff clearly sees something much bigger. Joe Witt Jr., specifically grouped Wilson alongside names like TJ Watt and Jalen Ramsey when discussing defensive weapons. Coaches do not casually use language like that unless they have real plans for a player, and when you look at Wilson's background, it actually makes perfect sense. At NC State, Wilson was at his best when attacking. His explosiveness, speed, and closing ability made him incredibly dangerous as a blitzer. He wasn't just a linebacker cleaning up tackles 5 yards downfield. He was disruptive. He could pressure quarterbacks. He could shoot gaps. He could threaten offenses before the snap and force protection adjustments. That's exactly the kind of trait Patrick Graham appears determined to unleash. The scary part for opposing offenses is that Wilson's athleticism also allows him to disguise those pressures. He can walk up near the line of scrimmage showing blitz, then instantly drop into coverage. That creates hesitation for quarterbacks. Even half a second of uncertainty can completely destroy a passing concept in the NFL. And frankly, Steelers fans have not consistently seen that level of defensive creativity in recent years. That's why these OTA developments feel so significant. For the first time in a long time, it feels like the Steelers are building around adaptability instead of tradition. The focus now seems centered on putting players in positions that amplify their unique strengths instead of forcing everybody into rigid assignments. Even the descriptions of Mike McCarthy's daily operation inside the building reinforce that same idea. Everything reportedly feels more structured, more detail-oriented, more focused on execution. And while some fans initially questioned whether McCarthy was truly the right hire, the early reactions from inside the organization suggest the Steelers desperately needed exactly this kind of approach, because talent alone has never been the issue in Pittsburgh. The Steelers have had stars, they have had leaders, they have had competitive rosters, but too often over the last several years, the team felt strategically behind the top organizations in football, especially offensively. The scheme sometimes lacked creativity, adjustments felt slow, development at certain positions stagnated, and defensively, the reliance on individual greatness occasionally masked deeper structural problems. Now, the organization appears determined to modernize without abandoning its physical identity. That balance could become incredibly dangerous if it works, and maybe that's the most important part of everything happening right now. This isn't a rebuild. The